And today we are going into a conversation around one of the issues that we saw come into the limelight, has been in the limelight for a very long time. Our Justice Thursday conversation today is around compensation for victims of protests, all the way back from 2017. And some would argue even before that, when we saw things that around post-election violence that happened. But let's come into that conversation this hour. Joining us is Mutemi wa Kiama, who is an activist known to all of us all and has been here and has been in the spaces for a very long time and continues with that. Good morning, Mutemi.
Good morning, Good morning, Dennis.
Morning,
Mutuma.
Good morning, Karibu Sana. Also joining us is Elias Mutuma, who is an advocate of the High Court and is also here in the studio with us today. Good morning to you both.
Morning to you, Ndu, and morning to you, Dennis. Pleasure to meet you all.
Karibu.
Thank you.
We're going to welcome you to the studio with today's proverb. Of course, we would love to get your interpretation of it as we get into this conversation. And we are in Botswana this morning, rather this week, and the Tswana people have said this thing. Particularly, you may have heard it before in terms of in other cultures and other traditions, but this is what it says. The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. We'll start with you, Mutemi.
That's a very appropriate proverb for this conversation, because what you're looking at is issues of self-esteem, issues of not belonging, issues of looking for love in the wrong way, and that's something that Kenya has been struggling with. We've seen young people being charged with terrorism, not because they are terrorists, but because they've disturbed somebody, and that somebody who has been disturbed, who thought they'd have peace until 2027 as maybe as president, are now burning down the village that they are in. Because if I'm going down, then I'm going down with all of you.
Wow.
I think that's my interpretation.
An interesting one for sure. You can never be wrong on interpretation, which is based on opinion, that's for sure. And what about you, Wakili?
Thank you. I agree with my brother here. I think what our brothers and sisters down south of Africa, Botswana, are saying is an acknowledgement that human beings are social beings who have a sense of belonging, who crave for attention and care and recognition. And when that misses from the very people that they're entitled from, then they find a way of venting, and that venting can come in form of revenge, and therefore it's important from the very beginning to give people a sense of belonging, to feel at home, to feel welcome, to feel recognized. That's my interpretation.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those with us. Let's look into some of these issues, and we'd like to get a background that we did hear, and it's coming from the courts to an extent, that because of petitions that were sent out, because of constant lobbying, continued activism, now that we hear that there is a demand for, but now there is an order given that compensation must then be given for folks who were killed, maimed, tortured, all sorts of things as a result of protests that have taken place, not just 2024, 2025, but as far back as 2017. Mutemi, can you give us a background for some of these?
I really don't think, I know victims, ODM, and the victims of the protests that have been led by ODM. There's been conversations around compensation. And I guess that's why even the terms of this proposed compensation is up to 2017 because of the protests that happened then and the protests that happened in 2023. But it's been more than calls for compensation. And part of the reasons why a number of people are very uncomfortable with these proposals is that what people have been asking for is reparations, not really compensation.
Okay.
And I'd like to pass my condolences to the families of all Kenyans who have lost their lives, to sympathize with the Kenyans who have been maimed. Not since 2017. I mean, this has happened since, I guess, Kenya became a colony. We have people in northern Kenya who are brutalized, the famous Wagala massacre. I'm just mentioning that because it's in the public domain. We have all this captured in the Dongo and the TGRC reports, whereby it's been documented of Kenyans who've been displaced, whether it's on their land or people who have died. It's alleged that over 5,000 people died in Wagana. The trauma of those people, of the people who lost their lives, and how destabilized they were, the traumas that people have lived with and died with, and their children have then come to inherit. And how do you then give a monetary value for that? And the opposition is about, it's not that Kenyans don't need reparations, I mean compensation, they need reparations. What is the difference? The difference is that we need a process where there's an inquiry into what has happened, all those things that have happened, and there's a process of determining what is the ideal remedy. What is because I think there's a legal term that I can't remember, but basically meaning offering solace, because you can't quantify a human life or loss of limb in terms of money. How much money? And I want to agree. I don't agree with former Senator Malala on many things, but I want to agree with him and what he said yesterday. What would the president value a human life at? Is it $1 million? Is it 3 million? Is it 10 million shillings? And if whatever amount, whether it's even $1 billion shillings, would he agree for one of his children to be killed and then he'd be compensated by Kenyans' money, in terms of money? And where was this decision made? What was the competitive process that even appointed Makao Mutua? Was there a cabinet meeting that made resolutions? Was there a parliamentary inquiry or process? This is basically, to be honest, a typical knee-jerk reaction by the government of Kenya since before independence, whereby whenever there's a public outcry on issues or atrocities committed by government, you appoint a commission, a task force, or a committee. But basically, the mandate of that committee is not the stated mandate. Its work is to pacify the public and then to cover up whatever it is, to show that there's a process going on. But since that process is not grounded on any legal basis, on any institutional basis, these are committee within the AG's office around victims' compensation. Why is it not the one that is undertaking this? Why is it that it's a roadside declaration by the president? Why is the Ministry of Justice, in all this? Where are all these other government, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, all these government institutions that deal with reparations? Who has been arrested for shooting people? And how can we trust the person who said shoot to kill and later on said shoot their legs, to then tell us now, after killing us, that they can compensate? What kind of country is that? So,
is it his idea to come up with this compensation? First of all, let's look at a little bit in terms of information. He's called the principal coordinator of the State Intervention and Compensation Framework. That's Dr. Mutua. Professor, yes. Right? And he's clarified that the government will compensate victims of protests and riots that occurred between January 2022 2017 and July 1st, 2025. Professor Makau Mutua, who also serves as the advisor on constitutional affairs, was responding to statements by opposition leaders Kalonzo Musyoka and Eugene Wamalwa, who dismissed the government initiative as unrealistic, something similar to what you're saying, Mutemi. He defended President Ruto and his broad-based co-principal Raila Odinga, saying they were only doing the right and noble thing for the victims, their families and their loved ones. Raila Odinga had led numerous protests between 2025 and 2005, I beg your pardon, and 2023, often issuing what he termed irreducible minimums that the government had to meet. These protests typically subsided once consensus was reached to form ad hoc committees tasked with developing legislative frameworks. Now, the question is, look, as uncouth as it sounds, once one is dead, they're dead. There's very little that you, in fact, if nothing, save for a miracle, do to bring them back. So whether this compensation is genuine in its intent or in its action then starts to be the question that we're asking. Eugene Wamalwa and Kalonzo Musyoka have said, no, this is just something to placate the people for now. It's not real. But if there's money that's actually coming out to then sort out the families, at least something to say sorry, is it welcome, or should it now be turned back and said, this is not genuine? Wakili?
Thank you, Ndu. This is a very emotional issue we are dealing with this morning, and very urgent for that matter, because it is coming when the images of the young people that we have lost in the streets are fresh in our minds. I mean, the last 2 or 3 weeks, you'd watch news and you'd be saddened and depressed by, you seeing people mourning in funerals, and so it's something very emotional. So to the extent that the government now is seen to acknowledge that something happened is something positive. We cannot really say that it's not a plus, it's a plus. To the extent that there is an attempt to acknowledge that the state was responsible, and this comes after a series of denials from government officials, praising police for the good work they have done. So to the extent that there is a form of recognition and acknowledgement, I want to say it's something that is positive. Mm-hmm. Is it enough? Is it timely? I think those are the questions that we should be dealing with. One is that when I look at the presidential proclamation that was pronounced on 8th of August, it doesn't tell us what legal framework it is anchored on. It's just a presidential proclamation. So what is the legal framework that is anchored on? We need to understand that. Secondly, what is the criteria of limiting the victims to 2017 to June 2025? We most certainly may witness future violations from police. We also aware that there were previous violations all the way from 2008, 2015. We have that data, and the agencies like Kenya Human Rights Commission have that data. So isn't it then discriminatory to limit it to just this period? So that's one of the issues. Thirdly, is the fact that this is a framework, or rather plan, that is domiciled with the Office of the President and Ministry of Interior and Treasury, and which was the other department. So it is a government affair, so to speak. The same government that is acknowledging that we violated your rights and therefore we need to compensate. I feel like there was need to broaden the scope of this framework to include independent bodies other than just government, because how do you trust the same government? Because the Minister of Interior, in essence, is in charge of the police. So how do we identify victims? How do we verify their claims? How do we arrive at the amount of money is to be compensated. How much, like my brother is asking, how much is enough for a death? How much is enough for someone who has been left incapacitated because they've lost their limbs or some other vital organ? So who takes up that role of assessing the damages and determining this is what you get and what this is not what you get? So I think there needed to be very clear guidelines involving a lot of stakeholders. That's the only way people would feel that it's genuine and it's sufficient.
It's interesting. I'm reading Professor Makau Mutua's defense of this compensation plan or initiative by the president, and he compares it to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I quote him, he says, transitional justice is a global concept. We are pursuing a structured framework to ensure accountability and fair compensation for victims. And this is the tail end. The focus is on the tail end. We need to compensate. So it's the figures that we need then to dish out to the victims. But I'm looking at the same comparison to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was created in South Africa. And it actually states that it was created through a clear legal framework. That was established under the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act number 34 of 1995. And the act was passed by Parliament to provide that legal basis then to beyond having the mandate and objectives, then to create a structure. And what I find interesting is the Act legally created 3 committees within that structure. So one was to focus on human rights violations. It was a committee by itself that was then going to investigate the abuses and collecting testimonies. The second thing was amnesty, an amnesty committee that then decided on amnesty applications based on the Act's criteria. Then the third and the last one was reparations that Mutemi, you're mentioning, and rehabilitation committees, which then recommended reparations and rehabilitation measures for victims because they're those who've been affected by everything that went on. Are we then saying what is being proposed here is a clear shortcut to the comparison that established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa? I'll start with you, Mutemi.
I think that background is it's a very good basis actually to have this conversation, and because it's not just the South African process. Based on that South African process, Kenya actually did have a Truth and Justice, the TJLC commission, that then was established by law, Parliament, and there were all those clear processes that were set out, and that actually would be the basis on which should the president and his government be genuine around this, and especially because of the issues of trust that have been raised. Then you would need such a process whereby people's representatives, Parliament, are involved. The people themselves, we have a constitution that calls for public participation in decision making around such things, are involved. Then one of the biggest things we've lost is trust. One of the crises we're having in this country is a crisis of trust, and Kenyans' trust in government. Such ad hoc pronouncements whereby you don't even know the process that you've just mentioned, a huge title in terms of Professor Makau Mutua.
Yes.
When was that job created? When was it advertised? What process did it go through to be hired to be that person who leads that committee? I mean, that ad hoc committee. So the fact that this is being done by proclamation without any legal basis, any judicial process being put in place, because we know a judicial process would then have mechanisms to decide, to even set figures in terms of compensation, which is about money, but also other processes in terms of offering solace. As you said, yes, you can give money, even $1 billion, but how do you compensate a parent for a child, a 12-year-old child who shot while they're watching TV. How do you, and I remember watching a clip of the mother of that child that you're talking about, saying there's no amount of money that can compensate them for that. What about the kids that child would have had? What about the grandchildren that child would have had? What about that whole loss to society? What about the trauma? And it's not just the people who have been shot who are dead. You asked about once you're dead, yes. What about these young people, some under 18, some 18, 19, 20, who are right now in prison? I think there are over 90 young Kenyans who are in prison just because they exercise their right to protest. They are in prison charged with terrorism. Some have not even been brought before court. They are just in committee and other maximum prisons. What does that do to them and their lives going forward in terms of the fact that they have a record? Their fingerprints were taken by DCI. They've been charged with terrorism, which means they are now under a terrorist watch, which is a global crime. Even if they decided to take up these schemes of going to work in the Gulf, how would they get passports? With the once you're suspected of being a terrorist, and how do you compensate that, even monetarily? How do you compensate that trauma, that loss of opportunity, that reputation damage?
So those questions are real questions, because you ask then how can compensation come through? And even if you ask then what is commensurate, what is enough to then be able to speak for a life or for a permanent injury. So the thing is, though, it is not just us in this room thinking those thoughts. So one must ask, if those thoughts are very clear and center of this discussion, the people who arrived at this compensatory mechanism, we would have to ask whether it's genuine in its nature and its makeup, because then these questions would have to come into all of this. What is enough? How do we say that a 12-year-old child who's watching TV in the security of her parents' home and then gets shot as a result of this, how do we say 100,000 shillings is enough? How do we say 1 million is enough? How do we say 100 million is enough?
It's not rocket science, because apart from police brutality that causes death and injury, we've in the legal sector we have similar instances that end up in court, and we can borrow a leaf from Fatal Accidents Act, the Law Reform Act, Work Injury Benefit Act, where you have a very clear framework of determining, one, how much is commensurate in the circumstances. Of course, it can be enough. For instance, when you get injured in the course of your employment, in scope of your employment, certain factors have to be put into consideration. For instance, your age. Number two, your earnings. Number three, the level of incapacitation, the degree and extent of injury. A medical report from a professional who will say, as a result of this injury, this is what is commensurate for this injury. And therefore, you cannot have one blanket figure for injuries and say, for any injury, it's 100,000. For any death, it's 400,000. It can't work. We must then do things right. One is to establish a compensation fund. Let us know, where is that fund anchored? Where is it coming from? Is it annual? Is it one-off? Two, who is in charge of victim identification and verification? How do victims get to report about this? Because as we speak, we do not even know. There's even a disparity on how many people were injured, how many people we lost. So can we begin from there, establishing who will be in charge of identifying how many people were injured, who was in charge? And I'm saying this because we've watched the inquest, the public inquest that are ongoing in respect of the death of Rex Masai, the disappearance of Brian Othiambo. We've all seen that. And it's quite unfortunate that a mother who has lost a child is taken through a process of then sort of proving that the death of Rex Masai occurred because he was shot by a police officer. To the extent that bring the bullet, an officer who was caught on camera doing it denies. So then who has the burden of proof? Okay, those are some of the things that we needed a legal framework on, because in instances like work injury, you apply the principle of strict liability, so that if it's a death that has occurred as a result of a bullet wound, you do not put me to task to show which police officer shot me, because I have no way of making that determination. The fact that someone has died out of a bullet wound, the fact that they are limping because there is a bullet launched in their limb is enough to indicate that state was involved.
Okay.
So those are some of the issues that we really need addressed before we move into this. And just to correct you, there isn't any compensation framework. It's just a promise, because it was just a presidential proclamation. But as to how it will be done,
nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
So if there was that there was that proclamation,
yes,
can we see that proclamation then to be an admission of responsibility for the things that happened? Mutemi?
Ideally, that would be the case. And part of the challenge many of us are having, especially people in the human rights sector, is that these processes, as Dennis has indicated, are not new. There's legal precedence around it. And even just, if you are to call it common sense, says, do if I wrong you, and I want you to forgive me, I have to admit that I wronged you, and then ask for forgiveness.
Yeah.
So where is that process of admission? There's an inferred admission. If the government says they want to compensate, that's inferred.
Yeah.
But where, even if you were to, for example, forgive the policeman who shot, they say they were under orders. Who gave the order? Under what conditions? All these things, even in police standing orders, are documented. For example, I think, I don't know whether it was here. No, it wasn't. I watched a show where a former police officer was talking about the process of going to the streets. That when they are issued with tear gas canisters, bullets, all those are documented. So that, as Wakili is saying, if a bullet is shot, if you left here with 10 bullets when you're going to oversee protests, how many bullets have you come back with? If you've come back with 9, where is that 10th bullet? When did you fire it? And you cannot even fire it without an order. Who gave the order for you to fire? Or if you say my life was under threat, I was attacked and I had to defend myself as the CS Interior and the president and the president's buddies have said that if you're attacking a police officer, they have a right to defend themselves. Where is that documented, and what is the process that determines whether that actually happened? So the issue is, if it is goodwill, for example, for the president, and this is about NADCO, it's about because ODM has been making noises around implementation, because even ODM supporters do not trust what is going on, and so I firmly believe this process is about making, getting them to calm down, to show that there's a process ongoing. It's about showing, this government, yes, we are in it, and we are pushing for this.
And if you have to spend some money, so be it.
So, goodwill would demand that it starts with the process, and because the process is there, the process, we know how this should be done, because we've had the TGLC, regardless of whether it was implemented or not. There's a judicial process that precedes this that shows how they should be done, and that then Kenyans cannot trust a process whereby the same person who gave the orders to shoot, and as much as they say the police do not get orders from State House, we know that is not the case. Even the same people who say that contradict themselves by giving orders to the police publicly on TV. So the only way, in my view, this can then start to seem like it's a process that is well thought after, is if the president would withdraw that proclamation and set up, whether it's a parliamentary process, a judicial process, or even a public inquiry that then sets up that commission to get there, so that then we can see there's goodwill towards that. But also admit that my government has done this, and because of that, then we are doing X, Y, Z. But there's inferred admission, but there's not been a direct admission.
I mean, at the moment, if we look at the framework that is housing this, what you'd call the initiative, it's under the executive office of the president. And there are all these other agencies that are now involved that we now know, for example, the Office of the Attorney General, the Ministry of Interior and National Administration, the National Treasury is involved, and the task force then is being led by an advisor to the president, in this case, Professor Makau Mutua, who's been appointed as the principal coordinator. Gentlemen, for both of you, how structured, in terms of structure, who is being left out here? Because this conversation is starting from an executive standpoint. The agencies involved are the same ones, from the Ministry of Interior, where we've had the issues and the proclamations that Mutemi you're talking about, from Office of the Attorney General, where there have been questions of how this case is then being handled and prosecuted in court, where we have a lot of young people who have cases of terrorism, for example. And then now you are roping in the National Treasury, whose ideally in this case their only role is to say, this is how much money then we can give. Which bodies should have been included in this then to have a proper structure before we even have a conversation on how much that needs to be given out?
Well, you just look at one of the agencies that you mentioned is the Attorney General Office. The AG's office has a Victims Compensation Board. Why isn't it that board that is then proposing this process? You know, it's legal. It's within a government agency that is about legal advice to the government. In fact, if it came from the AGs that the Victims Compensation Board has proposed this process, then we would start saying that there are institutional processes that are then leading to us having this conversation. I think that's my take.
Thank you. In my view, I think three key stakeholders have to be involved in this process. One, we must begin with the victims themselves. They have to be represented independently. Whether it's the Kenya National Human Rights Commission, whether it's independent lawyers, whether it's IPOA, they have to be represented, because they are the victims in any case. They are the target of this compensation. So you cannot just invite them to a process that they have no control of or they have no say. That's one. Two, of course, it's the Office of the Attorney General, because then that's a statutory body that has very clear guidelines on how to handle such matters. Then thirdly is an institution like IPOA, because then it has a lot of data in respect of police violations. And we do not have shortage of examples of where this has worked. In 2013, a UK-based law firm took up a brief to seek compensation for Mau Mau victims that were detained, that were raped, that were tortured. And the first thing they did is to ensure that they visited the victims. I was part of that process as a young lawyer. And what we used to do is go to the very old shoshos who are living in the 1950s, interviewing them, taking their statements. And therefore you would get a version of what transpired and what they went through. Secondly is that there was a requirement for the UK government to publicly and officially acknowledge the injustice. In fact, I remember the Prime Minister of UK went to Parliament and made that announcement that we acknowledge that our government was at fault. It was not right to detain, it was not right to have our soldiers rape, it was not right to torture. So that's a formal acknowledgement. Two is that he offered a public apology to the victims and to the Kenyan government. And just to cement that, there's a monument that is at Uhuru Park as we speak, speaking of that very fact that the UK government has taken up responsibility and apologized. So, just to answer your question then, we cannot have this compensation plan solely run from the office of the president. Other stakeholders must be involved, beginning with the victims. Yes.
So, how would it work when we look at other compensatory plans that have been made in different parts after areas of conflict and things like this? How would it work? And I guess this, what it would do is then point back to the genuineness of this, that how then you can be sure, if you had all of these things that we're talking about put in place, then you can say, okay, somebody is actually invested in making sure that this happens. But if it is a political proclamation, surely the president would understand the ramifications of this, would understand, not necessarily act. So what would be, from a legal point of view, also, when the president says something like this, whereby there's the political play that could be there's the political aspect that could be at play here, but then there's also the fact that these words drop and that there are people who are hanging on to every word that you speak, whereas you cannot bring back the dead, but that if there's something that would, how would he not understand that when you say something like this, that there are people who hang on those words and then they expect that you do the next thing, waiting for this penny to drop? What would be the next thing? And would he not understand the ramifications of what he says, knowing full well that there are people who are waiting to hear from him? Because like you said, you don't just say and it happens. Certain things have to put in place.
Like my brother is saying, we already have a department under the Office of the Attorney General that is in charge of victim compensation. That's the beginning point. If then it is established that this department is not adequate enough to attend to this issue because maybe of its magnitude, then why not propose a piece of legislation that Parliament would pass to create a fund, to create a body, and to create a clear roadmap, including things to deal with delays, because again, we might go through this, but then delays in terms of actual release of funds becomes an issue. And I'll give an example. I have been involved in instances where we go to court in respect of a victim who has been either shot. And let me give a very live example. In 2016, a young girl was shot while participating in games in Migori by a stray bullet from a prison warden who was in hot pursuit of an escapee from Migori prison. And her eye was gouged out. That was in 2016. I was given the brief, went to court, secured compensation for the girl from the chief magistrate, a reasonable compensation. The state appealed against that award. We went to the High Court. Judgment was delivered in 2019 in the High Court, which slashed that amount by almost half. And the AG has given the go ahead and compensate that victim. To date, almost 9-10 years later, we are yet to get that compensation. The AG has already acknowledged, the court has already pronounced itself on it, the Solicitor General has given an advisory, go ahead and pay. Simply, there is no money to pay.
How much was this award?
The initial award from the Chief Magistrate was 14 million. They appealed. When we went to the High Court, it was slashed to around 7 million. Surely, that is an amount that the government can afford. But then, how do you ensure that that happens if you do not have a very clear framework that says this will be the consequences of not dispensing this money within the prescribed time? So that's why we need a very clear framework, not just proclamations.
And that's where the problem is, because for the longest time, I've been around this field for 20 years. I've covered countless stories of victims who have actually grown tired of going to court, traveling with the cost and everything, seeking compensation. Today we're just looking at a different story here, where Pumwani Hospital has been told to pay a woman 7.5 million for negligence during labor. This was a case that happened in 2019. The court will pronounce itself, but now they chase to get that compensation, despite all these other legal hurdles and the appeals. It almost appears the state just never pays. Then the question is, when that is the situation we are in, what's the recourse? What does the victim do? What does a lawyer now like yourself, what do you do? Because you've exhausted all the legal channels, I'm assuming. The court has pronounced itself. Where else do you go? When the state...
And I think that's the point we are making in terms of having a very clear-cut process whereby there are even timelines. If I was to draft that, I would say the process has to take, should be a report should come out within the next 6 months, and any compensation that is done should be done within this financial year, and the government will allocate this kind of amounts of money. If we look at the victims of torture during the Nyao era, who went to court and were awarded, it took almost 15 to 20 years for some of them to actually get that money. Now you can imagine, let's say you are awarded 1 million shillings in 1990 something, and then you're given that 1 million shillings in 2025. What is the value of that in terms of that compensation then? What 1 million shillings was then, and what 1 million shillings is now? It has lost value. Even the decision, like the magistrate or the judge made then, in terms of compensation, is it being adjusted for inflation? Is it being adjusted for the trauma that you've gone through, as he's talking about, like waiting for 10 years? Your costs, because the costs are there, you're following up this money, as you're following up to be paid, you're letting go of some of the things you could be doing, could be economic or other things, or even going to school, because you're so focused on this issue of, and that's why you're talking about reparations, not compensation. That the process has to be seen to be just and fair. Just and fair, and take into considerations all these things. You have to bring in lawyers, you have to bring in psychologists, psychiatrists, you have to bring in doctors, you have to bring in counselors, other people. And that will for example, I was thinking about just the arrests of the last 1 month. Those young people, I think 1,500 young people, if they were to get a fair process, because I am very clear that those charges were trumped up. The whole thing around terrorism was about shutting down protests and criminalizing protest. Now imagine you have a process. Let's say, out of the goodness of his heart, the president said, okay, I admit my government has wronged Kenyans, let us do this. And so sets up a process, brings in religious leaders, the community, the victims, and that kind of thing. How much would that cost? Compensating that 1,500 Kenyans, young people whose lives have been damaged by this process. I'm seeing hundreds of billions of taxpayers' money.
To undo something that could have been avoided in the beginning?
There was no reason to tell the police to go and shoot young Kenyans protesting, exercising their right to protest. And even then, right now where we are, Nane didn't happen. Because every year since Sabasaba of the early 90s, we've had Sabasaba, Nane, Tisa Tisa. This year there was no Nane. Why? Because people are traumatized. How do you compensate for that? How do you quantify that, in terms of a monetary process? And, you mentioned the CS Interior is still, I think even yesterday, but one, congratulating the police.
Indeed. almost exonerating the police in some cases, what we I think would be looking
So
at.
even as the president says this, the actions of his interior CS tell a very different story. I was abducted in 2020 and 2021 twice, actually. The first time was ideally a civil case, and that case was never prosecuted. The ODPP, who was the current director of NIS right now, never went to court. I mean, the DCI wanted to prosecute me over trumped-up charges. The ODPP said there's no case here. In that process, I was, they broke into my house over an alleged civil matter, not even a criminal matter. There were no summons. There was no warrant from a judicial officer. I went to court in 2021. Up to now, that case has never been heard. It still goes through mentions. It's been dragging through court.
I would want to ask, though, what would be the rationale what would be the rationale for making such a proclamation without the intent or without the proper structure to then see any kind of payout? Look, even if it was that you have now established that there were 10,000 people who are in need of compensation and that you were going to give them a shilling each, whatever the case may be. What would be the need of making such an announcement without the clear intent? Because for what we've established already over the last hour, that intent will be shown by if you had used the offices. Do they have a notice? Do they have orders? Do they have a set up metrics to say, do this? What would be the point of making such an order if you didn't have the intent to bring it to life?
Let's give the president the benefit of doubt and assume that it is out of his the goodness of his heart and that he means well. And therefore, we can't then assume that there is any ill will or any ill motive around it. Of course, everyone is entitled to a different opinion. What I can give is recommendations to the president and Professor Makau Mutua. One, establish a very clear guidelines and framework that has to be anchored in our laws, because then if it is anchored in our laws, then we are safe. That framework should have a compensation fund that is independent from government, where the person in charge is someone other than Treasury. Let us have budgetary allocations. Let's set aside and say, this is the money, 10 billion, 20 billion, this is the money. Then let key stakeholders begin the process of identification and verification of victims. Once they are verified, let us have very clear timelines within which money should be released to the victims. But before we do that, let us have an official acknowledgement from government through either
Spice up your
wronged our citizens. We lost lives. People were injured, and therefore government is taking blame, and we apologize. That's how it's supposed to be done. It has been done in UK. It has been done in South Africa. There is no reason why we would be hearing the CS Interior saying one thing and the President saying something else. It casts a lot of doubts on whether there is any intention to take to action this. Thank you.
And to respond to your question around why would the President do that, it's politics. It's just playing politics. Because if you look at the context of how this has come about, that proclamation has come about, we know that in the last 3 weeks, there's been a lot of disquiet within the partner, ODM. In fact, they've had countless number of meetings with their necks and their members, and that with even the Secretary General of ODM, Edwin Sifuna, making quite alarming proclamations around what the report was about and their agreement was about and whether it's being followed. So we know this is a political reaction to that, and that the president knows he cannot survive without the support of ODM. So let's stop playing politics with this issue.
Indeed. It's a wait and see kind of thing, but of course that would be the call at the very beginning, that don't play, politics with the lives and remembrance and memories of people. Thank you both for being here this morning, Elias Mutuma, as well as Kiama. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, because it's necessary for us to do. Mutemi wa Kiama and Elias Mutuma, thank you so much. At 10:02. Good morning.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.